Hey, everybody. This is a very special episode of the show because not only do I have a guest on, but I have a guest on that I've been watching on YouTube for probably about 7 years at this point, Mr. JJ McCullough. Very good education videos, very good videos on Canada and North America. I'm not even very good at describing what exactly your channel is, so maybe you could do it. You've been doing everything from writing columns for newspapers, doing TV, and now YouTube. But what is the YouTube channel?
Yeah, I mean, I often struggle to describe it a bit as well. I've been doing it for 10 years. The sort of three C's that I have sort of associated with it on my banner headline is I make videos about culture, countries, and Canada. And so every time I make a video, and I make a video every week, I try to make one that at least sort of broadly falls under one of those three categories. And a lot of times it sort of winds up dipping into all three. And despite my best efforts, when I started my YouTube channel 10 years ago, I was finishing up a career sort of involuntarily at Sun News, which had recently sort of shut down. I had been a sort of TV talking head over there and on CTV before then. And I had kind of wanted to make a channel that wasn't political because I was kind of getting a little sick of political commentary. But, old habits die hard. And I still do make the occasional political sort of pundit video every so often on my channel as well. And I feel like a lot of people think of me as a kind of political commentator, even though, I don't go out of my way to produce an abundance of that sort of content. Although I did, until quite recently, I was also a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. So that was a career that overlapped with my YouTube career. And I only lost that, I think less than 2 years ago.
Well, you don't even do as much commentary as more so like history videos, even when you're talking recently about Justin Trudeau announcing he's going to step down as Liberal Party leader. You go into all of the ins and outs of how leadership races work, what the sort of different paths forward for the Liberal Party might be, and so it's like half commentary, which I enjoy because oftentimes anyone can make a video where Justin Trudeau sucks. Did you guys know this? Did you know that Justin Trudeau sucks? And it's always good for people to actually make videos that help people understand how politics works, and not in the way of how does politics actually work in the seedy background, but like how does like boring political like mechanics actually function. And I think your videos do that well. I even got some A's on some papers, both for my bachelor and my master's degree, by just watching the social credit video a few times through and making that my default answer on everything that had to do with like BC or Alberta social credit and explaining the movement.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's very flattering. I mean, I like to think that my videos primarily serve an educational purpose. And, I try to be sort of honest in them. I try to be more nonpartisan than not, to be fair, or at least objective. Being unbiased is, I think, a kind of difficult standard for anyone to meet. But you can be objective and you can try to tell the truth, even when it doesn't flatter one side or the other. Because I do think that what people, and especially young people, need is just sort of to understand the context in which sort of politics is happening. You can get opinions from anybody. But sort of being able to understand kind of the background, the sort of the historical context, and sort of the institutional kind of procedural things in an honest way, right? And this is sort of something that I've often cared a lot about, and gets me actually in trouble with some of the dare I say some of the more legacy pundits, is that I have a very unsentimental view of Canadian politics and the Canadian political system. When we talk about the parliamentary system or the way the political parties work and all of this kind of stuff, I think it's important that we speak sort of bluntly and honestly about how these things actually work, and not how they, theoretically work in some, textbook or on the Government of Canada website, or how some, sort of romantic, professor at some high-minded institution sort of thinks about the majesty of the Canadian political system, And I think we're seeing a lot of that unfold right now in the context of Trudeau's resignation and the Liberal leadership race. A lot of Canadians are sort of waking up to the realities of how our democracy actually works, and it doesn't strike them as something that's particularly, attractive.
Well, I'm going to exercise your skills right now in being nonpartisan, because we're going to talk about the Liberal leadership race, because why wouldn't we, while all the candidates are currently announcing? Because outside, I'm a very conservative person. So obviously I could just make videos say, Carney sucks. Did you know that he also is in favor of the carbon tax and that Chrystia Freeland froze trucker bank accounts? I'm just looking at it from the perspective of who's actually a good candidate, who could actually have an impact on the next election, 2025. Is Poilievre going to have problems with any of these people? But getting right down to it, this is something you and I both agree on. And then I want to touch on something that we actually both uniquely said yesterday. It's just a boring race. And then on top of it, even like the front runner candidates feel like a second tier Conservative Party leadership candidate, because we both highlighted yesterday Mark Carney celebrating raising $125,000 in 24 hours is genuinely not impressive at all. But maybe you can give your thoughts on why, how that struck you yesterday when you saw it.
Well, it's like, I know that we have to sort of adjust our expectations in the context of sort of Canadian politics versus American politics, right? Like, we're all aware that, every random primary candidate will brag about, oh, I've raised like $2 million in like 24 hours and that kind of thing. And like, I get that Canadian politics is smaller and all that, but like, what Carney raised is not even enough to cover the entry fee in his Liberal leadership candidacy. So which is like what, like 350 grand. So I think it
might just be 300,000, but yeah, maybe 350. But
yeah,
the hilarious thing too is that whenever I would mention this, it's not that much money if you divide it by the maximum donation, which is only $1,750. It's 71.4 maxed out donations given to him in 24 hours. But then people will say, well, why? It's only been 24 hours. It's like, well, did you not see the month-long setup to this moment? They would have had a Rolodex of donors, emails, phone numbers. They would have been text blasting people. They would have been harassing people to donate. And they got like what a municipal council candidate might be able to get at a, at a dinner.
Mm-hmm. No, and it's, I suppose in some ways it actually might reveal some of the sort of misassumptions of even his conservative critics, right? Like, because the idea was that, the great strength of Mark Carney is like that he's the elitist among elitists, that he's very plugged into sort of the Canadian power network, the rich and well-connected. And if they're not willing to open their wallets for him, in the wake of what you said was an enormous lead up. Like, he's been running a shadow campaign, I mean, arguably for years, right? Like, we're all leading up to this moment in which Mark Carney makes his triumphant entry into the Canadian political space. And yeah, for it to kind of go over like such a, tiny ripple in the pond, it seems profoundly underwhelming in a way that has to be, I think, troubling.
And that's the thing about the race. And I think this is what the donors are having to struggle with. It's not that they're wondering, who do I get behind, because these are such dynamic and different candidates. It's like, who is going to even move the needle in terms of getting the audience's attention? I watched the announcement launch video by Chrystia Freeland this morning. Genuinely better than anything that Carney's put out so far. And it's not actually saying much, though. It's basically, she delivered her message with some energy. I'm not even sure if the Jon Stewart interview really helped Mark Carney in any way. If people saw that, I did a short video on it. He's not terrible in it, but when you're on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show and you just kind of come off as fine, well, you got to be a bit better than fine if you're trying to be the prime minister who then builds momentum to beat Pierre Poilievre. I know people are saying, well, there's an Ecos poll out from Frank Graves showing the Liberals have closed the gap to just 11% after Trudeau stepped down. I'm like, no chance. If there is one pollster in Canada I do not take at face value, it is Frank Graves and Ecos. I don't have any vendetta against him, but when his last poll in December shows a 24% gap, actually 25% gap in favor of the Conservatives, and it's come down to 11% in January, that's not real. It's what I call an unmotivated polling change. If the poll from one to the next is very different, and there's nothing really in the news that would suggest that it would close up that much, because while Trudeau stepped down, all the problems of the government are still there, and he technically hasn't even left yet. That does not cause a 14% swing. But what would you even, if you were to having to define this race in a sentence, what is this leadership race all about?
What is it all about? I mean,
like, what's the fundamental question of this leadership race for the Liberal Party? Not for Canadian politics, but for the Liberals, what are we doing here?
I think, I guess this is two or three words, but like turning the page, like I do think that that is kind of like fundamentally what they're looking for and what they should be looking for, which is the idea like, we're putting a bookend at the Trudeau era. We're in some sort of new era that feels forward facing, right? That's not just all about looking backwards and sort of playing sort of cleanup for the Trudeau legacy, but we're kind of like forging a new legacy for the the 2020s, and we're kind of into a new era of Canadian politics defined by new ideas, addressing new problems, and a new kind of like mindset of leadership to deal with those challenges. And I think that Carney is like well positioned to be that kind of person in theory, and I think that's why the Conservatives are very desperate to tie him to the Trudeau government, because they understand that at some level he can make a more persuasive case to be something new. I mean, a man who's literally never held elected office before is by definition, somebody that is a bit of an outsider. And again, like you can argue that he's, been consulting with the Liberals for ages, which he has been, but, he can make that claim a lot stronger than someone like Chrystia Freeland was, who has, who has been, deputy prime minister, foreign minister, finance minister, on Trudeau's side since the very beginning. So I actually didn't see her campaign launch, but I'd be curious to see if you felt that she communicated any of that energy at all, because that definitely feels like it's her biggest liability, is her closeness to Trudeau.
She actually, that's the funny thing. I would actually say she is like, this leadership race is the Trudeaus versus the non-Trudeaus. And ironically enough, Chrystia Freeland is the non-Trudeau candidate and Carney is the Trudeau candidate. Not because of like public word association between the two. Obviously, people think of Freeland and Trudeau as more of a package deal than Carney and Trudeau, at least in the average person's mind. But it's because Freeland's explicitly running as the lady who said, I'm standing up to Trudeau at the end. This has gone too far. And she says that in the video and then pushes herself as like a tough anti-Trump negotiator. So she's trying to go away from sort of like the happy talk liberal rhetoric we've seen from Trudeau leading up to his announcement that he was going to resign, that Carney's also been doing. The whole, there's opportunities out there and we just need to seize them type boilerplate political rhetoric that just is quite gross when you read it. But there's really not that much to talk about in the Liberal leadership race. That's honestly why I'm struggling as a Canadian content creator. Like after Trudeau announced that he was resigning, I was just like beside myself. I'm like, what did they do to my baby boy? How am I supposed to talk about Anita Anand and make her interesting? At least she had the good sense to leave me alone and resign. But I mean, you
made a good point though. Like you made it, like in one of your recent videos, you made a line that I really liked and really has struck with me, which is that you sort of said that the Liberal Party under Trudeau has really had an aversion to the cultivation of big personalities, right? Like that there haven't been an emergence of people who kind of have a brand independent of just being loyal Trudeau foot soldiers. And I think that is now really sort of coming to bite them, right? You're having a race between just fundamentally boring people that are not dynamic and are not kind of like effective communicators, except in a very sort of limited, defend the policy kind of style of communication. And I think you can contrast that with what we saw during the Harper years, which is that you did see the emergence of some people like, say, Michelle Rempel or Pierre Poilievre or, Baird, the foreign minister, or whoever. Like there was a number of people that we can think of who were kind of characters, right? And I think Pierre benefited from that, and that's why he is where he is today, because he had a sort of legacy that he cultivated with the base, a sort of credibility that he cultivated with the base. And I think that while like Freeland and Carney are like good on paper and they appeal to a certain kind of like, pundit class person who can kind of like look down the list of resume virtues and sort of say this person would be objectively good, their ability to kind of resonate with people beyond, people like you and me who follow this stuff extraordinarily closely is, I think, a real sort of deficit that they're now having to desperately try to correct for.
And here's the thing, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party both have the same problem in that or not the same problem, they have the opposite problem. The Conservative Party, and we saw this especially under Erin O'Toole, is that they have a need to play outside their base. we need to expand the base. Even though the Conservatives arguably have a much wider base than all the other parties of the sorts of different types of people who will think about voting for them, where the Liberal Party constantly doubles down on their base. And if I'm to stereotype a Liberal voter, it is a Montreal, Toronto metropolitan woman past the age of 45. Somebody, especially a pensioner. When you look at the polling, you will always see, if you look at 65 plus, that is the demographic the Liberals do disproportionately well with. And a lot of the candidates are kind of the type of person that a woman in her 60s who's sees herself as progressive and sees herself as like looking out for the downtrodden, wants to vote for and wants to seem impressive for liking. And so it's highlighted or encapsulated by this meme I see going around on social media right now, where people put up Pierre Poilievre's resume against Mark Carney's resume. And I'm like, that is not how the average person votes. They don't care. And I don't even like the counterexample when people then start showing, well, Pierre Poilievre has had all these roles in government and Carney has had basically nothing. I'm like, you're missing the point. I don't care about the resume. That's actually the thing. I actually don't, and this is something I hear repeated a lot. It's one of those truisms where this person is a career politician. I'm like, I don't actually care. Are they good at the job or not? Some of the longest serving Congress people in the US were also the most competent. It's not because of corruption that they're there. Oftentimes people think corruption is just politics they don't like. Dianne Feinstein, as long as she was in there, and despite the fact she should have retired, far better senator than probably who's the new guy there.
Yeah.
Schiff. There you go. Adam Schiff.
Yeah.
He's far more competent and far more able to sort of triangulate her positions to the moderate middle of California. There is a reason why nobody could beat Mitch McConnell in a primary. It's not because it's rigged. It's because people in Kentucky actually liked him. That's why. But the thing is that I find constantly political consultants and whatnot are playing to a voter who's already on side in the Liberal Party, and then the Conservatives, they're playing to voters who will never vote for them in the first place. So like Aaron O'Toole is the perfect encapsulation of trying to get the Liberal Party's base, who was never going to shift in the first place.
Yes. No, I think it's kind of like this is maybe a little off topic, but I do think it's kind of like remarkable how there's been no real reckoning with the failure of Aaron O'Toole, right? Like that there's always this kind of narrative in sort of the Canadian sort of pundit class, and, you know, I'd sort of say kind of progressive urban Canada in general, that like, oh, the Conservatives would be doing so much better if they would just sort of tack more to the middle and be a kind of more progressive kind of party, right? Like you see this with the center ice Conservatives and that guy who's trying to create his centrist party and all that kind of thing, right? It's like, yes. So it's like, it's a line that you always see. And like, you're going to surely see it now this time where, you know, there's always this kind of person where it's like, well, you know, I wish that there was something between these two crazy extremes and all that. But it's like Aaron O'Toole, more than anyone else in modern Canada, tried to offer that in the last election. Like he went out of his way. He even self-identified as a progressive. He made such a big deal about how socially liberal he was and how his ambitions were not radical, and, you know, how we're not your dad's Conservative Party or whatever that line he used was, right? And yet it didn't work, right?
From Alison Redford.
Yeah, no, and it's like he did worse than Andrew Scheer did, right? And I just feel like there has been no reckoning with the consequences of that or the lessons to be learned from that. And that's just incredible to me.
I'm not trying to sideswipe anyone, but I always find it fascinating that when you go on some of these political like panel shows on CBC or CTV, and one of the commentators is like a failed Conservative campaign manager, and they're going to tell you what the Conservatives need to do and what the Liberals are doing wrong. I've seen one of these people. I'm not going to name them just to not be rude, but they're like, you know, I've been up against Justin Trudeau, and so I know what the Conservatives need to do to counter a man like Mark Carney or somebody like Chrystia Freeland. I've gone up against all these people. I'm like, you lost. Yeah. What is this? Does no one ever leave quietly in this business? Does anyone just realize they burnt the house down and just dance back into the background and let other people fight the fire here rather than saying, you know, I used to live in that house that's currently burning down. I know where you should be pouring the water on. It drives me up the wall. But speaking of these kind of moderate, progressive type political people, you and I both have an equal hatred for Zoomer social media politics. And that is also why I brought up Anita Anand, and us snaking back to Aaron O'Toole brings up Anita Anand again, because he was praising her as she was stepping down. This is something I find sidetracks so many young people when they get into politics. There is both the kind of, and I'm talking from the perspective of conservatives, but it obviously exists in the liberals and the NDP as well, that you get oddly hard-edged politicos who want to talk about, you know, we should slash the federal budget by 80%, or we should have zero immigration, or we should adopt a Catholic theocracy or something like that.
Yeah.
But the one that gets on my nerves, because honestly, I think, especially around staffers and in staffer culture, it's far bigger, is the enlightened centrist who praises the most boring politicians you've ever seen in your life. I see this on a daily basis. All of these Stan accounts, or I'm not even kidding, Kim Campbell, Charles Tupper, the 7-week prime minister, for people that you don't know who they are. And there were so many people saying, you know, Anita Anand would have been the exact person the liberals needed. And now they're pushing the idea that she should actually run for liberal leadership in Ontario if Crombie loses, because she'll beat Doug Ford. Like, guys, read a book. That's not how politics has ever worked at all. Like, I think this also ends up like making it so that people like 10 years into their political life of engaging, they still haven't done anything substantial. And I think social media politics has really ruined it. You've done a great video on that. I should edit it in right here, of why just fringe social media politics ends up actually just destroying people's understanding of, you know, how bills move downfield, how to influence stuff, how to sell memberships, how an actual campaign works. And that's even infecting Carney and Freeland's campaigns. There are staffers all around them trying to do the, you know, Mark Carney's rat thing.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. That was pretty cringe for sure. But no, I mean, I saw you, I forget if you talked about this in one of your shows or if it was in a tweet, but I think like the good way that you expressed it when it comes to this kind of like Zoomer sort of fascination with obscure politicians and all that, is that you said something along the lines of like that they assume that if someone is obscure and unknown, then that means that they are significant, right? And that somehow like this is a kind of like flex of how deep and substantial your political knowledge is if you're able to kind of like nerd out on a very sort of minor figure of political history. When it's like, it's opposite, like it's the exact opposite. It's like people that are big and famous are usually big and famous for a reason, like that they've accomplished sort of substantial things. And if people are small and obscure, it's like, yeah, maybe once in a great while, there's like a forgotten figure of history who had an underrated effect on things, but they've really sort of like overlearned that lesson and over applied it. And I know what you mean as well, where it's like, I mean, like, I feel like you see this a lot when it comes to like obscure political parties, obscure political movements, you know, and it's like this obsession with putting everything on the political compass and putting everything in tier lists and just like kind of treating politics like it's an RPG or something, right? Where it's like, can you amass like the biggest kind of like, you know, appendix of all of the different monsters and goblins and Pokemon and stat lists and tier lists and all this, right?
The political compass and the political spectrum in general has just been like a net negative for people being able to understand things, because people are very like hierarchical in how they think about things. And as soon as they see the compass or the spectrum, they're like, okay, I need to be the furthest right or the furthest left. That person's left. I need to be even more left. So there were like NDP accounts talking about how Carney's actually a capitalist shill because he says that we need to grow the economy if we want to pay for social services. If anything, Carney's saying something extremely socialistic, that he thinks the free market is just a vehicle to spend more on social programs. But that wasn't enough, because don't you know that he's actually a left-wing trader? I have been seeing other left-wing creators attacking Jagmeet Singh because he got rid of the commitment to democratic socialism that was in some subsection of the federal NDP constitution, as if anyone cared. But this is a deeply like interesting and important thing. But as
Yes.
soon as you introduce the spectrum of the compass, people are like, I'm going to be the most centrist. I'm going to be the most authoritarian right or like libertarian right or left or whatever. It's like, you're not. This is where I try and promote a philosophy of reasonableness. And naturally, my audience tends to be older. We actually have kind of opposite audiences because mine is news based. So people who watch the news and follow like minute news details day to day tend to be, earning a salary and whatnot. They're not younger, but you tend to have a younger audience. So you're doing a good job of trying to, snap people out of the artificial moderation. But maybe this is a good transition to the third topic that I was planning today, but we'll probably snake in and out of it, is that there's so much what I would call grifter commentary out there, grifter political engagement, and it is fueled by social media. I think social media is a good thing, but the way so many people use it just drives me up the wall. There was a video that a Canadian commentator made the other day and every commentator who's trying to show how conservative they are, one day will make actually the conservatives and liberals are the same. Actually, they're the same on trade policy, on foreign policy, on immigration. They're actually the same. It's like, no, I know you want to get the nod from like the PPC right that, oh, this guy's our guy, but you're just wrong. Or people who will bring on, and this is a more egregious example. Recently, Benny Johnson had Andrew Tate on his show. And then as horrified people are saying, well, why are you having a pimp and like alleged rapist on your show? And he's like, oh, do you guys not believe in free speech? I'm like, you're just doing this for the engagement. There are so many commentators who literally just do their thing for engagement these days.
Yeah. No, it's really quite disturbing because, I mean, I think that what you gave, like the Benny Johnson and Andrew Tate, is a good example of that, because you have, and this is, I think, very much a dysfunction of the right, which I think anybody who sort of self-identifies as a conservative should be concerned with, is that you have increasingly, like, conspiracy theory world has become sort of right-coded. Right. And so as a result, like conspiracy theorists and complete sort of wackos and people that just have this like incredibly adversarial relationship with like civilization, like that these people are very dopaminergic as far as personalities go. Like they're often very entertaining. They're very flamboyant. They're shocking in a way that's, kind of, yeah, again, like sort of titillating and in a very sort of shallow kind of way. And the problem is that sort of in the game of commentary, in the game of making media, which is ultimately all about just attracting eyeballs and clicks and view counts, like it behooves you to go for that kind of content, right? If that's all you're looking for. And so you kind of have this terrible sort of nexus in which you kind of have like right-wing grifter types, and then you have conspiracy theorists becoming right-wing coded, and then so you bring that together, and then increasingly it seems like if left to its own devices and market forces alone, a lot of right-wing commentary will inevitably just descend into platforming sort of cranks of various sorts or another, whether that's Andrew Tate, whether that's, Alex Jones, who is of course now also right-coded, Candace Owens, even, Tucker Carlson, like all of these people seem to be spiraling more and more and more in the direction of just platforming like highly sort of flamboyant cranks.
And when you have like, when you're tied to no principle in how you do your commentary and what you believe, so many of these people who are on the right, in fact, then become extremely unprincipled in social ways, in economic ways, in terms of what policies they back. That's why you see people like Candace Owens now joining Redbook or whatever that new Chinese social media app is, because it's all just about the attention. And this is my thing about grifter commentary, because grifter can often be just a throwaway term that doesn't really apply. Because as Ann Coulter has pointed out in the past, if I'm a grifter and I'm still beating you in a debate, what does that say about you, that I'm beating you and I don't even believe the things I'm saying? But there is a new class of people who truly, I don't think Candace Owens actually thinks Emmanuel Macron's wife is a man. I genuinely do not think that she cares. And I don't mean this in a way that what she says isn't wrong. I don't think that Candace Owens is actually anti-Semitic. I think she is saying the things that get clicks and doesn't care. Maybe she will eventually become it in her heart because she said enough things like that. But so many of these people will literally misunderstand politics on purpose. The H-1B visa debate that happened in the US was from like people can have there was genuinely good disagreements to have with what Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk said. I had some problems with it. They were kind of not addressing that that program is used for labor, like abuse of labor in terms of just bringing in people for jobs that you could easily pay somebody for in the US, but you can get like subsidized labor this way. Same thing happens in Canada all the time. The temporary foreign worker program is so subsidized, it actually does incentivize owners to bring in foreign workers rather than domestic. But so many people are turning it into, oh my goodness, Elon Musk and Vivek want our country taken over by India. I'm like, they didn't say that. And this also happens in Canada too, where creators will misunderstand politics on purpose to say, a year ago when it wasn't going to happen, is Trudeau going to resign? He's not going to resign. Yeah. Or people acting shocked that things are happening. If you had a cursory knowledge of what's going on, none of this is shocking at all. So, and that's the clickbaity nature of social media. But I find that so much of this politics, and it also obviously happens on the left too. I was just scrolling through someone's channel today, the Surf Times, where one channel, he's one of these Canadian guys who only makes videos on the US pretty much. One of his videos is on about how bad this guy Asmongold is or whatever, who's some Twitch creator. And then 4 videos later, it's how right Asmongold is about Elon Musk.
Well, like, this is the thing, right? And I do think that this is something that audiences need to get better at, is that we need to demand more accountability from the pundit class, from the commentators, from the grifter commentators especially. But we all have sort of like the attention span of goldfish these days, and that's something I find very frustrating, is that a creator can make some wild posit one day, and then 3 days later he can posit the exact opposite, and everybody just kind of like sort of shrugs it off, if they can even remember what he said 3 days prior, right? So people can sort of say like, oh, Trudeau is finished, 3 years ago or whatever, and then Trudeau proceeds not to be finished, and then it's just kind of like, oh, whatever, we're off to some new thing. As long as like you keep getting those dopamine hits, as long as like you keep being fed a steady stream of sort of sensationalistic reporting in one direction or the other, people just seem to be going for that and don't really care if these sort of takes all add up to anything coherent, ideologically, or even just in the kind of, I don't know, sort of like narrative sense, right? Yeah. Like their predictions of what's going to go wrong, does it go wrong? Or does it actually, like, do those plot lines just kind of like drift away when something new and shiny comes?
Yeah, and it genuinely pays to be stupid, in the sense that everything is just a whole new world every single day. Trudeau said this, I'm outraged to like an absurd degree, and I'm not articulating myself, and it just becomes insult comedy or whatever. And not that I don't like insult politicians, I don't like. I think anyone watching my videos realizes I do that a decent amount. But a comment I see a lot in my comment section whenever I'm talking about polling, especially federal, that always gets on my nerves a little bit. Whenever I say like, oh, the Liberals are all the way down at 22%, and you get the comment, they should be at 0. Oh, that's still too high. I'm like, it actually isn't. Just think about it for a second. How many federal employees are there? How many very wealthy people live in Toronto or other metropolitan cities who the economy doesn't affect, and they are not voting on the same issues that you're voting on? And it's like, you just have to understand the landscape. If you understand the landscape just a bit, it becomes it's a much easier world to understand if you just you actually kind of look into what the other side's up to and what they believe and all this sort of other stuff. But I guess what's the big concerning trend that you see coming in Canada, or is there any sort of thing that you think we need to look out for in the 2025 election?
I mean, I would sort of say, like, as somebody that is invested in Pierre winning, and I do think that it's important for the future of this country that Pierre win and that he win a majority government. I mean, I've kind of laid my cards on the table as far as that goes. But I do think I think that sort of people of this persuasion should not be overly confident. Like, I think that there are concerning signs in the way that the Conservative campaign is being run. I was tweeting out earlier today and got a lot of positive feedback on this, that I do think the Conservatives have put way too many eggs in the axe the tax basket. I think that they've been too singularly focused on the carbon tax at the expense of everything else, which, and I think we've sort of seen that the Liberals have a strategy for dealing with that is to just basically move on from the carbon tax or ditch it or get rid of it, right? Which I think puts the Conservatives on a bit of a back foot. So I would say, like, you should not take it for granted that the Conservative Party is incapable of making mistakes. I do think that there is a not impossible possibility that a new prime minister, a new face on the Liberal government, could give them a bit of a boost, or at least give some voters of the sort that you're describing a reason to give the party a second chance. I think that just politics is more fluid than we think it is, and if there's something that I've learned in now being in my 40s, it's that you can get too arrogant in sort of assuming that sort of things are fixed, particularly in this kind of like world that we inhabit now, where, like I said, people's attention spans are very short, and new news stories can have a dramatic effect to kind of like swing people's perceptions in a very short period of time. So, I mean, I do think that all things being equal, there's plenty of reason to suspect that the Conservatives will win, and will win big, and will win a majority government. But it also, there's just a little sort of sense that I have that things are maybe a little bit more fragile than we think, and that there are reasons to suspect that the kind of momentum and fluidity and just novelty that a new Liberal leader, particularly if the Liberal leader proves to be kind of cynical and crafty. There was a very good piece in The Hub written by my friend Sean Spear, where he talked about the ways in which, you can't fully count out the possibility that the NDP, that Jagmeet Singh could, find reason to, forego his previous declaration that he was going to vote no confidence on the first opportunity. Like, there's no reason to suspect that, the parliament wouldn't necessarily be brought back when Trudeau has promised it would be brought back. Like, there's even sort of like the most extreme scenario is that, they work out some deal with the NDP and they even blow past the fixed election date law and don't even feel the need to hold a vote in October of this year at all. That the Constitution technically says that you could have an election a year later from now, right? So like there's just like a lot of little seeds of doubt that have been planted, and you can't take it for granted that any of these are going to blossom into anything major, but they're worth sort of keeping an eye on, and that Conservatives should not get too arrogant and too cocky about the degree that this is 100% in the bag. I would say that right now there's maybe like a 5% sort of chance of doubt, but I think that could easily grow.
And here's the thing that the Conservatives often do to trip themselves up is when the Liberals start catching up, even though there was no chance the Liberals were actually going to go as probably low as 20% when it comes to election day, there's always that kind of returning to the party effect when people don't really like the leader, they don't like the brand, but it's the one that they usually vote for. People are very default. Even in this election, 70% of people who do vote are going to vote for the party they voted for last time, except for the PPC, which died off pretty fast. But most Liberal voters still vote Liberal. It's not like the Liberals have lost more than 50% of their support. They've lost a third, but you need to be in the mid 30s to really be in the game in Canadian politics in terms of being able to form government. But what the Conservatives often do is that the Liberals start catching up. Okay, we're losing. Now, guys, we're going to start falling into a death spiral of becoming more tight-lipped. We're going to take safer policies, and we're going to differentiate ourselves less from the Liberals because, oh my goodness, the Liberals are coming back. They must be doing something right. Rather than realizing you're currently doing something right, you should stick to it. So I always find it concerning when I hear stories where Conservative MPs are being sort of coached on what to say on policies and don't say anything that we haven't approved. It's like, why do you think Harper lost in 2015? That's always the thing that drives me up the wall, is sometimes the people who are involved in the Harper loss in 2015 are telling people how we need to win an election a decade later. And it happens to do with the exact same thing we did in 2015. We stick to a very narrow set of policies we're going to talk about. We only talk about those, and we want the whole overly talked about concept of a bozo eruption. We don't want anyone saying something dumb that's going to put us through the floor. And it's never actually that causes people to lose. It's like Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick did not lose because he was too right-wing. It's because he ran a campaign that didn't want to win. if you were trying to win, do you run on a platform of a 2% HST cut? No, you should run on a 2% income tax cut and have cut the HST a year ago. But it was just a kind of like a dying campaign that didn't give people a reason to show up. That's why Harper lost in 2015. Trudeau mania wasn't that big of a deal back then. It was more so just that Harper didn't give his own people a reason to vote, but Trudeau did give his people a reason to vote, and they won. And it wasn't even, and it was still pretty close when you actually look at the popular vote.
This is why I feel like I'm a little bit sort of concerned with the axe to tax sort of rhetoric, right? Because I think the Conservatives feel themselves, or felt very sort of pleased with themselves, that they had found like the perfect issue, right? Like the carbon tax is very unpopular. It's obviously been very sort of deleterious to a lot of Canadians. And it's not like controversial per se. Like it's not sort of tainted with any sort of scary social issue or something like that. So it felt like the perfect one note to kind of prosecute the case against Trudeau on. But, you know, and that's fine as far as it goes. But like I sort of said, like if that issue goes away, then what are you left with, right? There are lots of other issues that, you know, I think the polls suggest that the Canadian people are pretty agitated about. I think a big one, frankly, is immigration. But we know that that is kind of like the scary no-go zone as far as the sort of Conservative Party has traditionally been concerned with. So I do worry that if the carbon tax sort of fades a bit as a sort of front of mind issue of salience, that then the Conservative Party is going to lapse into much more sort of traditional kind of mushy rhetoric and sort of shy away from the kind of kind of just sharper tone, which I think the Canadian public is ready for, not just on immigration, but I think on crime is, I think, another big one where, you know, you need to sort of strike a bit more of a kind of stereotypical conservative tone. And again, like, I'm not arguing that like the only way the Conservatives could win, because this is obviously not the case. They don't have to go full PPC. I would not want them to go full PPC, but I definitely think that they have to have, you know, sharp, focused, decisive positions on a number of front of mind concerns of the Canadian people, as opposed to, you know, just the kind of endlessly sort of safe, same old kind of approach that the conservative consultants prefer to run on.
I'll add that even the PPC at one point wasn't going full PPC. I remember when Poilievre announced that immigration's still too high after Mark Miller had cut it by 100,000. And the absurd thing is, after they cut it by 100,000, it's still probably 300,000 too high. I've always advocated for a cap for 10 years of 100,000 with actual strict means values tests, skills tests, not too many dependents. And then you can kind of get back up to even by having it lower. But then the PPC immediately, even though their limit in 2019 was to 150,000, they immediately said, no, moratorium. I'm like, good job, guys. You've made yourselves irrelevant. Because at the end of the day, you have now made the window of people who are willing to vote for you very thin. And you're going to have to win 100% of them to probably even just come into second place. And this is where people get politics wrong. There are the people who think that you got to go full controversy to win, and then the people who think you have to avoid controversy. And it's just not how it works. As you've been basically pointing out by talking about crime and immigration and some of these other issues that are big deals, there are a lot of cultural issues out there. Controversy is good if you are on the side of the controversial issue to talk about. That's like the 80-20. There are tons of issues out there that are 80-20 prospects for the Conservatives. Immigration is going to be very controversial to run on, but 80% of people are going to agree with you. I campaigned in my riding for the Conservative nomination in Calgary, Signal Hill, and I would go door to door talking to people who would immediately say, well, I'm not very conservative. I'm kind of centrist. I bring up immigration. They're like, yeah, it's way too high. It was kind of like that begrudging. Everyone's like, yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I did like zero effort getting people to agree with that. But I guess moving on to a new topic. How is Jagmeet Singh even still leading the NDP into this election? This is a bit out of left field for you, because I didn't mention I was going to talk about this before.
No. It's a good one, though.
I am amazed that this man has been able to dig his nails into his desk this deeply. The NDP is such an insecure and like a party that lacks so much self-confidence internally. They're very confident that they're the party that should be leading Canada publicly. But internally, when they got rid of Tom Mulcair for having a perfectly good result, for the NDP in 2015, and now they're letting Singh have his third attempt to maybe have a result we can even describe as mediocre. It's crazy. Like, what's your social relationship with Jagmeet Singh? Like, what have you? Because you've been having to cover him for a while now at this point.
Yeah, I mean, like Jagmeet Singh is like, he was an interesting sort of propositional candidate when he was first made head of the NDP, you know, back however many years ago that was, right? Because like the theory behind Jagmeet Singh was that, you know, he was a personality, right? To go back to what we were saying before, like he is an interesting character. Obviously, he comes from an interesting background. You know, he's sort of young. He communicates in a perfect style, or in a distinctive style, clearly not a perfect style. But anyway, like the theory was that there was sort of something novel about him and that it was worth a try. And I don't begrudge the NDP for giving him a try. I think that the case, I even made a video about, you know, a sort of bearish or sort of bullish case on Jagmeet Singh. I made a whole video that probably is a little cringe to rewatch in retrospect, where I sort of said like he had potential to be a sort of slayer of Justin Trudeau on the left. You know, that didn't happen, right? So I think in any sort of sane party, when you try something, when you put something up the flagpole to see who salutes and no one does, you know, you pull it down the flagpole and you try something else. But the NDP just has a very weird culture. You know, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but there are sort of like culty elements to the NDP, one of which is like just kind of like blind deference and trust to the leader and sort of the ruling kind of clique of the party. You know, the fact that Jagmeet Singh got a like over 80% approval rating at his most recent leadership ratification is just insane. Like there is no rational reason for a man who lost 2 elections in a row to get an 80% endorsement from the party faithful, unless this is a party that just kind of has its mind in some place other than, you know, political strategy, and they're making decisions based on some weird kind of like culty logic where it's just kind of like, well, he is the leader and we must support him and the party must be consolidated and loyal. It's worth noting that the only reason why Tom Mulcair got booted as well was because a substantial, you know, chunk of the NDP faithful, the real sort of party line, you know, dogmatists, never trusted him because, of course, he came from outside of NDP world, which is the great sin. You know, you have... And this is, again, where sort of like the culty vibe comes from in the NDP world. I've seen this, you know, because in British Columbia, this culture is quite sort of strong, where you have these people and like, you know, they're involved in the Canadian Federation of Students, which is like an NDP front group when they're in college. And then they go to work for the Canadian Union of Public Employees, which is also allied with the NDP. And, you know, they go to like certain bars and they like their families marry other families, and you know, they like, just the whole world is so little self-contained and really is very hypercritical of anyone who comes from outside of that world. But because you live so tightly in this NDP bubble of NDP logic and like NDP slogans and NDP policy positions that can never be questioned because we've been trying them, you know, again and again, and at some point the Canadian public will be sort of radicalized and awakened to the truth of the NDP light. It's just like the culture of the party is so sort of dysfunctional. It's not a surprise that they're as bad at politics as they are.
I was watching just today, this morning, some NDP TikTokers talking about like the labor movement. Every single one of these guys wearing like a beanie on their heads and, you know, like in like they're like wearing t-shirts and like chino pants sitting on a stage are talking about labor like they were part of like the labor riots in Winnipeg back in like 1905 yes. or whatever. And it's like, guys, settle it down. The thing is, it's all about, it's like this is what represents the NDP. This, not the average NDP voter. That's why when you look at the polling, he's actually secretly in the same position Trudeau is. Half the party thinks that he's not the right leader, but the people who hold memberships and vote in leadership reviews want Singh. And I think it's a deeply insecure party that, because Singh is to the left of Mulcair, it feels like a repudiation of left-wing policy or politics to get rid of Jagmeet. So that's why they're giving him this many tries, because, well, Mulcair had betrayed us because he wasn't progressive, even though he secretly understands the party far better because he understands the fundamental voter in the NDP. If they want to be successful, is like the worker, is the actual guy who is it works a tough job. And now it's like an HR party. It is the party for people who work unionized office jobs and
Yes.
college students. And so we talked about before, I mentioned that the conservatives, their fatal flaw is they often are trying to play to a group of voters who will never be part of their base, even though their base is actually quite broad already. And then they end up betraying those people and they tick them off like O'Toole did. The liberals are constantly doubling down on like a very small fraction of people who are loyal already and they desperately need to expand. The NDP panders to a base who will not show up no matter what they do, even if they like them. And that's young people. The ideal Jagmeet Singh voter, who he very much comes across like, is an 18-year-old girl taking anthropology, who probably is not going to vote at all.
Well, and then the problem, though, is that the NDP, because it's this old legacy party that has a very settled way of doing things, is that it's actually not receptive to kind of like the youthful dynamism that should, in theory, be a sort of leftist party's greatest asset, right? So it's like you have a lot of like young kind of like leftist people who try to get involved with the NDP, and oftentimes they get very frustrated by it. They get turned off by it because it is run ultimately at the end of the day by this old guard of kind of like fat union bosses and, you know, these kind of like entrenched kind of like white collar bureaucrat types and these like party loyalists who have been there since day one. And, you know, like there's a kind of like aged kind of core to the NDP as well. I remember seeing this photo that I thought was just so fantastic. I should try to see if I can find it and share it. But it was like of Jagmeet Singh at some NDP convention. And it's like, you know, Jagmeet Singh, sort of like tall, thin, you know, handsome Indian man being flanked on both sides by these two big, fat, old white union bosses. And it's like, that's kind of like the NDP in a sort of like in one image, right? It's like you can put different faces on the party. You can put different masks, whether it's Mulcair or Leighton or, you know, Jagmeet or whoever. But it's like at the end of the day, it is still just this very slow moving, entrenched kind of political machine that is ultimately so heavily bound up in these entrenched political machines of the labor unions and of the entrenched sort of like, you know, white collar bureaucrats who now disproportionately make up the Canadian labor movement, such as it is. And just the party is so averse to change, is so averse to new ideas and new blood. You know, I had a friend actually who went back out of some sort of sadistic masochistic sense. He watched all of the old leadership elections, leadership debates, since such things began being televised, you know, with the old man Trudeau and all the rest of it. And he said it was striking when you hear like Broadbent and Audrey McLaughlin and all these other kind of characters, they all are sort of saying the same kind of talking points. Like the NDP has just changed so little.
Honestly, people sometimes see Jagmeet, and it's frankly because he's a South Asian Sikh man with a turban on, that he's very different. He reminds me, maybe this is McLaughlin, but he reminds me of the typical kind of square woman who's leading provincial NDP parties, or the lady who was in the 2000 debate with Day and Chrétien. Somebody who stands up and says, won't people think about the social programs? Yes. Won't people think about the postal workers? And it's like sanctimonious, obnoxious. I think what defines Jagmeet's leadership better than anything is the fact that he did a Twitch stream with Hassan Piker. That defines him down to a T. The man, I've heard he actually does genuinely care about getting his pension, which is sad to me, considering it's not even worth that much. He doesn't even get it for like another couple decades. But the man is a media hound. But the problem is he also isn't a good media hound. If he was good at this, he would actually embrace the fact that he's a champagne socialist. He would actually try and be even ritzier in a certain sense, and even more kind of plush in the way he presents himself as this stylish figure who's better than all these square politicians trying to seem like average Joes. I'm definitely not an average Joe, but he,
which is what Hassan himself does, right?
I know, and that's that's why it perfectly defines him. He's a man living in a, I believe, 3 million or 13 million, one of the $2 million home. And he's there screaming at landlords and talking about how we should bathe in the blood of capitalists in Minecraft. And it's like, dude, you would get mad. So you're not a bad person for owning this large of a house. But if somebody living right next to you suddenly started renting out a room in their house, they're now a dirty landlord, even though they have made more housing available. But yeah, so that's
I think you're.
No, you're good.
No, no, I think, but I think you're on to something, right? Like it was like the line that sort of Eva Perón said in Argentina, right? Like, you know, she always had like jewels and furs and this kind of thing, where it's like you must sort of like outshine the enemy, right? Like you must sort of be more like you can sort of beat them at their own game. You can beat the capitalists at their own game. You can lean into it. You can be like just kind of proud at your wealth and decadence and good looks and all the rest of that, but then still sort of fight for sort of socialism, right? Like it feels like a paradox, but clearly like Hassan has proven that there's an appetite for that kind of thing. But Jagmeet's problem is that he can't be his authentic self in that way. He kind of has to like be this kind of like awkward guy who is like, you know, kind of interesting, but then is ultimately still boxed in by this very sort of ossified NDP culture that won't give him the kind of independence that perhaps he would enjoy in an American system.
He should be the guy doing the hour and a half long podcast, but I find that he's actually the most sloganeering of the leaders. The bootlicker for billionaires thing is the dumbest line I've ever heard, because it's so leftist coded that it just ends up making everyone uncomfortable. And so the NDP, oddly enough, has a lot of the same flaws, even though they're somewhat successful, that the PPC does. They needlessly turn people off just to show how pure they are. That I am willing to throw these people to the wolves, and like, you know, I don't need your votes. You guys are all scum. And maybe one extra topic we could talk about before we end this, and this is something that you're not involved in any way, and I'm not really involved in either, but I find this is one of those, again, those things that drives me up the wall because people don't understand how politics really works. All the PPC influencers currently complaining that the PPC is not going to be on the debate stage in 2025. And I look at this and I'm thinking, like, guys, if you understood actually what campaigning was, you would know why you're not on stage. And I find so often people just think that they deserve to be at the goal of being an elected office, and that it will, haven't you read the platform? It's like, you're at 3%, you're at 2%. Why should you want to be on the debate? Well, it was promised that if we had 5% in the last election, we'd be on the stage this time. Let's imagine there was something called the No More Lockdowns Party, and it gets 7% in the 2021 election, and then they're pulling flops to like 0.5% because lockdowns are gone. Do you think that party should be on the debate stage? And they're like, well, that doesn't matter. They did this to get rid of the PPC. I'm like, no, they didn't. And so I'm not sure how much you usually talk about the PPC, but what do you think is going to happen to them in 2025?
I mean, I'll just be frank. Like, I in general have a very, very low opinion of small parties, of fringe parties. Like, I feel like if you're a small fringe party, you're a small fringe party for a reason. You know, you're often like a party that's kind of like run by people who fundamentally don't really understand politics, don't really understand strategy, often have a very sort of like arrogant and very sort of like entitled kind of attitude towards the political sort of system, you know, and I feel the exact same way about the Green Party, right? Like, no one has been a more consistent critic of the Green Party than me, I'm happy to say. Like, I have been arguing against Elizabeth May and her one-woman medicine show since she first sort of rambled onto the scene 20 years ago, right? So, and I just see the PPC.
Paul, by the way, Anami Paul was an actual good Green Party leader. She had the most sensible carbon tax position of all the leadership candidates or the leaders in 2021, because they were all saying the carbon tax should stay. And while she said that, she says we should get rid of it on all agriculture. And it's like, that's kind of smart. And then, they didn't like her because she was not fringe enough on Israel. She was a Jewish lady, and she didn't hate Israel enough. That was actually why they got rid of her.
The great sort of unreported fact about the Green Party is that it has a huge anti-Semitic faction, and that you cannot, like, as much as, you know, the mainstream media sort of portrays it as like, oh, it's the environmentalist party and like it's defined by that. No, and it's basically just like a crank party of various conspiracy theorists. And if you make any sort of movement that's open to conspiracy theorists, it will inevitably develop a strong anti-Semitic faction. And I think that's always been the case, you know. Dmitry Leskaris, the guy who very close to beat Anna Maypal in the leadership election, is like an open, like anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. He's been accused of being an anti-Semite by no less than Prime Minister Trudeau himself, right? So it's like the party has a huge problem with this kind of thing that's not often commented on. But again, like,
I told people this too, because I hate the movement on certain parts of the right of maybe Russia has a point. I'm like, guys, Russia is targeting you because you are easy marks right now. Do you know who the historical easy marks are, and they still are? The Green Party, both in the USA and Canada. Damian Louskaris goes on Russia Today, and he even tours around Russia all the time. Why is Jill Stein literally at every dinner she's ever been with Putin always sitting at his table? Because they saw the anti-imperialist Green Party as the vehicle for sort of like pro-Russian politics in the U.S. And now that there's certain people on the right who are saying maybe this country, which stopped reporting alcoholism because it was so bad, and the church attendance rates are like the lowest in Europe, maybe this is the trad paradise we've all been looking for. And it's like, it's not.
No, but it's like to get back to the point of what you were sort of initially sort of framing this up to be. It's like, I think that it's fair to have expectations for fringe parties and for small parties. And I don't think that we've set the bar extraordinarily high, right? Like, if you can't get one friggin' MP elected, and, to kind of go back to what we were talking about before, the Zoomers that are obsessed with like political esoterica from Canada's past, right? When you look at like the list of every stupid party in this country's history that's been able to get like one MP elected, the anti-Confederation party, the pro-prohibition party, all sorts of different social credit parties and factions of social credit party, different Marxist parties. Like, the bar hasn't been set that high. Historically speaking, we've had all sorts of flaky parties that have been able to concentrate enough of their resources in one part of this country to get one MP elected. And if you can't even pull that off, despite spending, multiple campaigns trying to do it, I think it's fair for the debate commission people or the mainstream press or whoever to conclude that maybe this is a party that doesn't have a great future. Maybe this is a party that is not resonating with the Canadian people. And as a result, maybe we can afford to kind of not pay that much attention to them.
Oh, and by the way, they didn't just say PPC, you're not allowed. They changed the rules so that your past election performance does not affect your future debate prospects, because that's obviously silly. The rules were probably set up that way because an issue like this had never occurred where a party technically qualified, even though they're not relevant at all anymore. So the current rules are you just have to hit 2 of the 3 criteria points. One is that you've elected an MP in the last parliament. You didn't just cross the floor. It is your MP that you elected. The second one is that you have candidates in 90% of the ridings. There's probably some modified version for the Bloc Québécois if you're a regional party. And then the last one is you just have to have 4% or higher on average in the polls. If they were competent, you could easily do that. You just have to spend money where it matters. And this even happens, and this is where people almost kind of consume politics in like a very toxically spiritual way, that as soon as that a party has wronged them, it is that the whole thing is corrupt and is the fruit of the poisonous tree. Now, I have more reason to have a huffy issue with the Conservative Party than anyone else, at least in Alberta right now. And the thing is, it's not really worth it. Not like, oh, it's not worth it, I can't win. It's not worth me attacking the party. And I'm not saying this in like this kind of Soviet, anything for the party kind of a way. But when 99% of people in the party are perfectly fine to me and like 2 people messed me over, is it worth me then jumping on any fringe movement that says we are not the party instead of just hanging around, doing my thing, and eventually people noticing that maybe we kind of owe him some amount of recompense? And it's like, that's really what happened with Bernier, is assuming that grievances and like the spiritual corruption of something is something that matters to the average voter. Like, have you ever done door knocking before in a campaign?
Oh yeah.
You have? Yeah. So I don't know. I just imagine that for some reason, like, people who get into the commentary business sometimes don't end up doing that. But like, when you actually talk to a voter, you will realize how average they are, how just not a lot of thoughts about politics, even now with Trudeau around. There's a lot of people who know they don't like Trudeau, But past that, they don't have strong opinions, and you need to really talk it through. I had a PPC organizer, a guy who is a regional director, one time say, "Oh, I've never door knocked because I've never had my opinion changed at a door before." Like, that is arrogance personified. That I would have never had my mind changed by a door knocker, so I'm never going to door knock. It's like,
Yes.
well, who could have guessed why you only got 3% in the riding you ran in?
No, absolutely, right. So again, it's like, it's a similar problem to the NDP, right? Like, you kind of create this kind of culture of purity and purity testing and sort of maintaining that purity and sort of creating a narrative that you're kind of like, you're too good for the rest of the world, right? And it's kind of like the rest of the world's obligation to sort of become enlightened to your brilliance, and then for them to inevitably sort of come to you. Like, you don't have to do anything substantial to improve yourself, to make yourself more impressive, to engage in any sort of like, sort of tactical outreach. It's all just a matter of like, you just keep doing what you're doing, and at some point people's, third eye will open, and then they'll realize that, that they've been wrong up until this very point. This
is where you get the woke left and the woke right, where much of it is based around the idea that everything's corrupt, and until you have your third eye opened about how everything's bad, then I can't help you. And it's like, I'm going to go around dating people and just being a massive jerk, and then I'm going to say, oh, they rejected me because the world's unkind and cruel.
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, like, and it's like, it's not a surprise that the PPC and the Green Party, and I'm sure I remember I once had a friend who had some involvement with the Christian Heritage Party, if we remember them. I think they're still lumbering
I
along.
talked to people from them. They're an honest fringe party. We're just here to basically give people tax credits so we can promote the things that we believe in. Do you know that actually the Social Credit Party still exists in Alberta?
I'm sort of vaguely familiar with that as well. I think that it still exists.
Alberta is the corpse of social credit that's been taken over, actually intelligently, to then just be a way of a pro-life group giving out tax credits while being very partisan.
That's pretty wild. I know that there's still like John Rustad, the head of the Conservatives here in British Columbia, who is a much less sort of like in many ways ideological person than he gets credit for. I was once at an interview with him, and he mentioned, I don't remember if he mentioned this in the green room or on the show itself, but that he actually was trying to bring back social credit because he's an old man, and I guess for some reason thought that was a better winning brand in British Columbia. But he said that there is still somebody or like a group of tiny people in British Columbia that are still clinging to the social credit, are still the legal owners of the Social Credit of British Columbia Party, and he couldn't wrestle it from them. So that's why he went to be the head of the Conservative Party of British Columbia. So
by the way, did you know that Bill Vander Zalm was actually an advisor on the 2024 campaign? Here and there.
Really? Is that so? That's remarkable.
Vander Zalm is an example of my theory that I don't think any Dutch person has ever actually died of old age. I think they just eventually ascend, because Dutch people are the only white people who age like Asian people. Bill Vander Zalm could run for something today. He's like 92 or like 89 or 90. Yes. He looks 60. The man looks 60. Also, by the way, congratulations, Bill Vander Zalm. He was actually vindicated on the HST finally, because BC did not have all of its tax revenues taken away from them by the federals when they just decided to cancel the HST everywhere.
He's an interesting character, our former premier, Bill Vander Zalm, that I definitely have often felt that if there was somebody in Canadian politics who could pull like a, Jerry Brown in California and, win a second term like 40 years after having left the first time, I've often felt it was like Vander Zalm. And it was often kind of like curious to me that Vander Zalm, because he was very involved in the fight against the HST. He's been, kind of just always on the margins of BC politics. And
he does interviews still.
It's crazy. He still does. And it's just curious to me that he never made another run for the premiership. He tried to be head of the Reform Party of British Columbia, which was briefly a kind of party in sort of the late 90s. He didn't really sort of succeed at that. He never contested that election for complex BC reasons. But yeah, like it wouldn't shock me if, he might be past the moment now, but it always seemed to me that there was this kind of like looming kind of sort of threat that he posed, that he could get back in power if he really put his mind to it, because he's just an odd and like remarkable figure in a lot of ways. So
well, apparently he's going to be alive for another 100 years, so he should think about it at some point. I love watching his old interviews on the Webster Show, because he's just a very characterful type of person. He has a great voice for radio and whatnot, and very understated skill or attribute to have like a really good voice to listen to over time. But I guess I'm forgetting that you live in BC, so I think I should finally end off on this last topic of what do you think is the future for David Eby and the BC NDP now that they're kind of in government? When I say kind of, I mean I don't feel like they feel comfortable in their current position.
They don't, and and I've spoken. I still have some connections in the BC party. I mean, or in the BC NDP. Not that I was ever part of it, but I know people in there from when I was more involved in formal journalism and stuff, and they were legitimately pretty spooked by how close this election was, and I think that David Eby comes from a more pragmatic faction of the NDP that frankly has, I think, been in ascendancy for a while in the party, right? Like Premier Horgan, who I think is, who passed away recently and was generally quite popular because he was pragmatic. Like people don't know this, I think, in other parts of Canada, but here in British Columbia, under an NDP government, we had the least restrictive COVID policies of anywhere in Canada. We got off really easy in COVID, to the point where sometimes when I hear other Canadians talk about lockdowns and this kind of stuff, I find it hard to relate to, because we just didn't have that kind of stuff in British Columbia. People could go to the gym. I went to restaurants and supermarkets and shopping malls, and my life, we had the mask on, but beyond that, my life was more normal than not. And I think that's in part because we've had an NDP leadership that has been, quite pragmatic and careful and worried. And I think Premier Eby has signified this as well, the way that he's flip-flopped on a lot of sort of lefty ideological policies in a way that a more dogmatic leader would not. When it comes to drugs, he's flip-flopped on that. When it's come to involuntary treatment for addicts, he's kind of flip-flopped on that. He talks a lot about crime and all this kind of stuff. And yet the NDP brand is still so toxic in the eyes of, clearly half the province, that it's still not good enough. And for an untested party, which like the BC Conservatives, which, I voted for them, but they do have a significant crank problem, and no one can deny that. And I think to come so close to losing to this group of sort of, as they would sort of see it, misfits, I think has really troubled the NDP a lot and scared them. And I feel like they're a party that is a little adrift and not quite sure what to do, what the province wants of them, what a reasonable agenda that they can sort of pave forward when they have a narrow majority or a narrow minority that's kind of backed up by a flaky, Green Party in the legislature. It's a pretty uncertain time for BC.
And you're actually right, because although I consider David Eby, especially for Alberta standards where I'm at, a very left type of political figure, like very left. Like I wouldn't call him center left at all. He is left. There are a lot more people, even much more further left than him in the party. Like there are people who, in their bios during the election, just openly said that they're trade unionists, which the person's a lawyer. And if they are, and any lawyer using that term knows what it means, that is the idea that unions and the government should literally directly run the economy, which is, I'm not sure. I'm not even trying to be like, oh, shocking. That's what fascism is. Fascio is what an Italian union was, and that's why it's fascism. It's trade unionism. It's the idea that the government and the corporations and the unions should run the economy. And tons of people who are just openly democratic socialists, openly just anti-capitalist inside of the BC NDP. And I think I would almost say that David Eby had the same election outcome that Danielle Smith did in 2023. He didn't win. His opponents just failed to win. Danielle Smith ran, frankly, a bad campaign in 2023. She was saved by Rachel Notley announcing she was going to raise the corporate tax burden by 33%. That's what killed her in Calgary, because she lost by like 5 votes or like 100 votes. And a lot of these ridings that the UCP narrowly squeaked it out. The BC NDP were almost saved by the fact that they had the taxpayer, public financing of their party. They had a $7.8 million spending advantage over the last 4 years. So naturally, more people know who they are. I was campaigning in that. I actually brought my mom along, even though she's from Calgary, to come help door knocking and whatnot. The NDP would have in a one little area 2 people who'd go in pairs to every single door to get out the vote. They were like oozing cash, and they literally got the majority by 22 votes. And even now that's in contention.
Mm. No, I mean, like, British Columbia has faced a lot of growing challenges in terms of cost of living sort of crises. The drug situation is very profound and is not just a Vancouver problem, has been sort of spreading across the province. Crime is a very sort of significant problem, and there is just kind of a sense that the NDP is just not well suited, does not have ideas to deal with these problems because of their sort of ideological priors are so strong when it comes to the sort of the right or wrong way to sort of think and talk about these issues, right? That they're not a nimble and pragmatic party in the way that they need to be. But again, I do think that sort of like grinds, that sort of NDP orthodoxy is, I think, perceived by a certain group. And I would probably disagree with you a bit on your characterization of Premier Eby, but maybe that's just because I'm a British Columbian and I've sort of seen this party and the different factions that, in an Alberta context,
or Notley, like they're pro-oil type, or generally they're not going to shut down the oil and gas. They crack down on crime. They generally keep things the same. They put out one safe injection site.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of the general sort of narrative of British Columbia NDP politics is that during the 1990s, especially under the Glenn Clark administration, there was this kind of sense that like that was the real like true believer, like the real kind of like Marxist types in charge, right? And that was a disastrous period of governance for the province, and that is sort of something that we've never like fully lived down, right? And then that has sort of like spooked the NDP ever since, and then that's why sort of somebody like Premier Horgan, especially after Adrian Dix, who I think was a much more sort of doctrinaire socialist, he was the previous one who lost to Christy Clark. And then when Horgan got in, he very much identified himself. I remember even interviewing him once for a local paper here, and he said, like, I'm not a socialist. I've never considered myself a socialist. Like, I don't represent that faction of the party at all. And, I think Premier Eby is a similar way. Like, he kind of comes from the more, like, he is a sort of civil rights lawyer, civil libertarian. He used to be head of the BC Civil Liberties Union. Like, he comes from that kind of flavor of leftist world. And but that being said, there is still that very sort of dogmatic faction of the BC NDP that, demands a seat at the table and has an influence on, no matter how pragmatic the premier is, that side of the party still deserves to have some bones thrown to them. But I think the thing is that you have a lot of kind of like middle class voters now who do associate the NDP with, soft on crime, kind of socialist economic policies, pro-drug policies and that kind of stuff. And so what you see now is you just have a very, very divided province. Like it is remarkable how close that election was. One of the closest elections in provincial history was our 2024 provincial election. And so something has to change. Like someone like either the NDP has to get better or the Conservatives have to get better, because I think right now both parties seem like they're quite stagnant, like that they've kind of like reached a natural limit of how much they can sort of expand before they start to hit up against a natural ceiling of people that are just deeply, deeply skeptical of the NDP or deeply, deeply skeptical of the Conservatives and what the Conservatives have become.
And I think the main mistakes the BC Conservatives made were just, in my opinion, because you every once in a while got the kind of somewhat crankish element who would be kind of like not the face of the party in terms of they're a hired member of the campaign, but of certain kind of more PPC-ish type people who represent themselves as like the hardcore base. But I think the bigger problem was just like it was honestly, and I'm not trying to make an excuse for them. It was the money, and it was the allocation of the money they already had. Do you know how many people follow them on Facebook still? Only 18,000 people, which is nothing. And it's like, why didn't you spend something growing the page before the election? You can't gather your forces mid-writ. You need your forces on social media and other places gathered. Then you do stuff with them. Don't just try and get them on the fly. The money is an excuse a little bit, because you can do it with no money at all. It's very easy to do this stuff with like $0. And I found that there's a lot of $0 solutions to problems that were just not pursued, because you ended up actually, frankly, getting too many united people sort of sticking around who had the same kind of very stagnant bureaucratic ways of doing things, but they didn't have the money associated to carry out any of the plans.
Yeah.
But maybe, so I guess that's probably it for us today. But the last parting question is, what hairstyle are you going to be going for next in 2025? Because you've gone through about not even three, what am I saying? I'm like probably 8 different hairstyles over the past few years.
It's funny that you ask that, because I was actually thinking about this last night. I like having long hair. I mean, people respect you when you have long hair, I must sort of say. Like, it's an interesting sort of phenomenon. You know, men, women, people respect a man with long hair, because I think it sort of signifies a kind of like rebelliousness that a lot of people don't have the courage to pull off themselves. But I often kind of flip-flop on this, because when I have long hair, I want short hair. When I have short hair, I want long hair. So I've been thinking about going back to, having my hair short again, even though I know it'll be controversial with my audience, but I'm just a man who likes novelty in his own appearance. So
you kind of have a bit of a Noah Antweiler Spoonie vibe right now.
Okay.
I grew up in that era of like 2011, 12, 10 YouTube, of all those like critics who were just up against their beige wall talking about movies. I was literally watching a Cinema Snob movie before this, if you know who that is.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
So I don't
even know if you're kidding about that or not.
People will stay tuned. I don't know. It's fun. I mean, like, it's fun to be able to, we're at the end of the day, we are in a visual medium. We are creating sort of visual stimulus in addition to our hard-hitting intellectual analysis. And so I do think it's important that anybody that's engaged in this kind of practice has some kind of sense of visual flair and is willing to mix things up a bit to keep it interesting.
I attempted to shoot a video not wearing a coat at one point, and I felt weird the entire time, and I eventually had to go upstairs and get one. It's a tick. It becomes a brand thing, even though I don't usually wear it out of the house. It's weird, but I actually have. Too bad you don't film like videos where people can see your feet, because I have like a really like big shoe collection that is so underappreciated. I own a pair of Victorian button boots where I have to take a hook and like button them together or whatever.
That's amazing.
On that very strange note, that's probably it for this interview. Everyone go check out JJ's videos. There is literally probably over 100 hours of content to consume if you haven't watched it yet. All great stuff. It will not remind you of anything I do in a good way. I have the low effort channel. He has the high effort channel that makes me very insecure. So make sure you go check them out, because I guarantee we actually have little crossover between our audiences. But thanks for coming on, JJ. And is there anything else you're working on this week?
I'm just actually, as soon as we end this, I'm going to get cracking on my latest video, which is a history of presidents standing in rows together. So
standing in rows together?
You know how like when the presidents kind of like all line up, it's like Obama, Clinton, Bush, and Trump and all that. Those photo ops. I've always liked those photo ops, so I wanted to make a video that was kind of like documenting the history of those photo ops and see who were the first former presidents to stand in a row together.
That's so obscure, but that's actually interesting to me. And also, I want to know the weirdest lineup of which presidents you didn't assume would ever be in the same room together. Yeah,
I think
like,
that people are.
What is the longest? What is the longest historical lineup they've ever had in terms of the latest age, and then also like the amount of presidents in one room? I think that probably goes to like the one where like Ford and Nixon are there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you'll have to watch the video to find the answer. But one thing I would say is that it's people forget how long Harry Truman lived. Like, Harry Truman didn't die until 1973. So like he was around for like Nixon and Johnson and Kennedy and all of that kind of sort of set. So
there was kind of an era of presidents that after they became president, they had the good sense to get like botulism and die like 4 years later.
Yes.
Chester A. Arthur, Calvin Coolidge, all these sort of other people, just exit quietly, kind of a thing. But,
I mean, I think we're gonna enter an era, I think, where it might just be Obama for a while, because all the other former presidents are really getting up there in age. They're all, not to go off on a tangent about this at the last minute, but
no,
did you know that
anyone watching this long probably doesn't mind more content?
Bush, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Trump were all born within a few weeks of each other in 1946. So they're all more or less exactly the same age. Biden is a little bit older than those. So that's you have four of the five living former presidents are all pushing 80 or already in their 80s. So, and some of them are looking a little rough, whereas Obama is still just in his early 60s. So it's not hard to imagine a scenario in which, in just a few years, Obama might be the only living former president.
That means we basically only had two real boomer presidents in a certain sense. So, it might be an indictment of the boomer age, that all the hippie stuff that had gone on in that kind of generation ended up kind of ruining them in terms of political relatability, where all these other guys were very career focused, get into office, build a legacy, and then run for president. Because you don't really get that many boomer Bob Dole type people that are around, where it's that guy's a statesman. You get a lot of flash in the pan guys who pop up suddenly. Jimmy Carter was kind of one of those people, but obviously not from the boomer generation. But Bill Clinton's the one.
Yeah. No, Bill Clinton was the one, and it is. I don't know. generationally, the presidents have been weirdly non-diverse, right? Just the idea that we just have all these presidents from sort of the late 1940s, and no boomers in the sense of people from the 50s, no Gen Xers either. Obama kind of is a Gen Xer, but kind of not. He's
right on the line.
He's right on the line. 1961 was when he was born. So he's technically just a really old, I guess a really young boomer. So I don't know. It's an odd mix, but I think that does suggest that once this sort of crop dies off and once Trump is gone, you could have a very dramatic gear shift in terms of the youth of the presidents, because I do think it's just going to switch straight over to millennials, and you'll have sort of people of JD Vance, AOC, that kind of crew will be the next sort of lineup of presidents in their 40s.
Fair enough. Well, anyway, so make sure you guys stay tuned for that video. And on that note, see you guys all later.